Brilliant. Well, I'm just delighted this is happening because we've known Sybille for a very long time and followed your brilliant work with your PhD. And that's now done, isn't it? You've now got your PhD,
It
and
happened finally.
that's fantastic. I'm so pleased. It's such a great subject. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you and John do what you're going to do. So just thank you, and I'm so glad you're doing it.
It's a pleasure.
Right, it's Sybille and me now. That was a very swift intro, Chris.
Rick, sorry, just before you start, John, Rick, could you pin Sybille and John so they pick centre stage? Thank you.
So Sybille and I had a preparatory conversation for this, which went off in all sorts of interesting directions, and I suspect today we'll do exactly the same. And when looking at her doctoral work and her area of research, the gods smiled in that they presented a real life situation, which I've been interviewed about a lot in the last week, which really speaks to the opposite of deep participation. So whatever the opposite of participatory leadership and collective intelligence is, I think we can see it playing out in one of the big corporates over in the US at the moment. And the situation I'm referring to is what's played out in Google last week, which is, for those of you not familiar, you had a group of employees who took part in a sit-in as an objection to the company's strategic direction, which included providing services to the IDF. The response of the executive was to fire everybody. Now, from a dialogic point of view, this is quite an interesting perspective. That one, I would argue that that if you as employees, the only way you feel you can be heard is via a sit-in, there is something not quite right about the nature of the relationship that exists between staff and employees. There would be an absence of a collective understanding. And if for the executive, the only response you have is to fire everybody, that again would show that you're drawing on a very limited approach to what the power relationship is between you and your staff. So that, to me, and then again, when I was talking to various journalists about this, they would talk about a couple of years ago when there was the power balance between tech employees and the employers was they would make all sorts of grand promises, like the bring your whole self to work argument and all these sorts of things. And that, of course, has now completely changed because there is now a relative oversupply of employees versus employers. So an interesting thing there. So I was thinking, in terms of teeing up for Sybille, who is going to bring her huge experience into this, is that question of, can shared leadership be a reality? And I love this notion of deep participation, because again, what I see an awful lot in my research is that shallow participation. It's largely a marketing thing, or it's a defensive thing, or it's driven by the legal case. And I think this idea of understanding Sybille's story of when a senior leadership committed to cultivating a shared leadership environment, and I'm just really fascinated by what drove them to think we are going to make this step, because it's a little bit like being pregnant. I mean, it's quite a binary choice, this one, because if you do commit to this shared leadership, you can't back out, because if you do back out, you are going to be left with a hopeless mess. So, long rambling introduction, Sybille. How does your thinking about the Google situation and things like that, how did that resonate for you and your work?
Well, I mean, when I read the article, John, that you kindly sent through, it was interesting because you were right. There was for a start, there was no space for dialogue. There had been no structures or processes or meaningful structures put in place in order to it would appear, for at least some type of negotiation or understanding about what really mattered to the staff. It would, so that we go pivot straight to command and control response, which is, okay, let's leverage our power. You're out. We don't like what you're saying. You don't fit. So already what the article brought out for me were things that I actually recognized when I was doing the study. So there are power dynamics at play, even though we can, we can trail lovely statements like bringing your whole self to work and have beautiful brand sentiments. It's not, this interaction between staff and their senior leaders is not happening in a power vacuum. So, that's what it really brought out. It was writ large. There was, power dynamics at play. And you asked somewhere in that introduction, you asked about sort of, why, I love that. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You can't, can you? It's the whole deal or nothing. So why did they decide to do this? It was really interesting, and it was a genuine commitment, because this housing association, this is where the study took place. It was a longitudinal study. It happened, I was researching them over about a 6-year period. And also this transition, or this journey to a collective leadership response within this organization began back in 2011 and continues to this day. But so we have to go back to 2011 to say, well, why did it start? Now, it was really interesting because the numbers were good. It was a housing association in the northeast of England, and it was performing very well. There was nothing to be embarrassed about particularly. But the chief executive started to notice things changing in the operating landscape. So internally, there was a reason why it was initiated. They conducted a well-being audit amongst the staff, because strategy was being created by the top team, exclusive of other of the input of other functions. So that was interesting. They did this well-being audit. They found that there was poor communication. There was a sense of alienation on the part of the staff. There was a real them and us kind of attitude, and also a lot of stress. So even though overall, in the main, this organization was performing well, there were these symptoms of illness, organizational illness, which the chief exec was not happy about. She'd climbed up through the ranks. She'd started as a housing officer, going around seeing tenants, and then made her way, very slowly did the climb up through the, the organizational hierarchy, and became a chief exec. And she wasn't happy seeing unhappy, thinking that her staff were coming to work every day and being miserable. Now, that was the internal response. Externally, what was happening was that she was beginning to notice, because do you remember after we had the financial crash, didn't we? And so everything was in chaos again. So that, the world's economic, the economy was in chaos. So that meant that this particular housing association and the sector were facing severe changes. So, drastic reductions in funding. In terms of technology was coming online. It wasn't as, it's far more integrated now, a decade or so on. So there were technological shifts, there were major economic pressures. It required, it was that kind of push for change, which requires innovation. And what this chief exec said in her decision to become pregnant, what she said to herself was, it can't just be me. It can't just be a culture of, and I quote, Angela says. We needed greater participation, greater involvement of people at all levels in order to make the necessary changes and shifts in a way that would be sustainable, but also agreeable to her staff. So she recognised, if you like, the illness of the staff, illness in inverted commas, but also recognised that the world was shifting. And it's really interesting, when I started looking into the subject, there are writers that would reinforce that. There are writers like Joyce Fletcher, who I think is mentioned in my, biography. She talks about the idea of 21st century leadership is not reliant on the single leader. It's because the nature of work is changing, because knowledge is dispersed in the organization. You cannot be a total expert in absolutely everything going on in your organization. Ergo, the nature of the relationship has to change from an individual leader to perhaps a decentering, if you like, a more pluralistic or collective response.
And just a couple of the things that really stood out for me there. I was very fascinated by the idea that Angela had grown up through the organization, so she knew it intimately. And I was again thinking about the habits of parachuting in, executives, coming in at a certain level. I was just thinking, actually, she really knew it intimately. She knew it in a deeply embodied way. She knew what it felt like to be in that thing.
Yeah, she was committed to that area as well. Yeah.
And you just reminded me about, again, this, how we move away from the focus on the heroic individual. And everybody's been talking about, we need to move away from heroic leadership, and its persistence is extraordinary. Because as you were telling the story of her wanting to say, I don't want it to be Angela Says, I was reminded of it's a 1997 or 1998 article by Henry Mintzberg. And it was when IBM was going through one of its periodic dips. And Lou Gerstner, I think, was brought in, and there was, and again, on the financial press, all attributed the success and the turnaround of the IBM performance to him. And Henry Mintzberg wrote in his article, which I said, so Lou did this, all by himself did it. The hundreds of thousands of employees, they had nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
I mean, what did it take for Angela to be credible? To move away from that heroic, because the popular thing and the zeitgeist would still say, Angela may say it's not Angela Says, but we still think it is Angela Says. How could she show that she was really committed to this?
Well, I mean, now you get down to sort of, the steps on the journey. But what was most fascinating, what I did prior to going into the actual study itself, I interviewed all of the senior execs individually and got their story about how they'd experienced this shift, obviously including Angela and starting with her. And what she said was that she had to do an awful lot of work on herself first. And the senior executive team, had to actually, you talk about embodied, they had to experience what was it really like to share leadership. So before you start going off, saying, oh, no, we've just changed, getting the slogans ready and getting the print run, you've got to actually think about what does it really, really mean. And they almost did it like it felt very action learning, in the sense of they had phases of team development, senior leadership team development, which actually is where shared leadership belongs. There are a lot of terms. Shared leadership belongs actually within a team or a group setting, actually, in terms of research. And then distributed leadership is, it plays out over time and across organizational functions. But it was interesting. They started by undertaking some their own shared leadership development, where, if you like, the focus wasn't just on, okay, so what am I like as a leader? What are my skills? What's my character? What's my style? They positioned themselves in relation to each other. So their development was, how do we develop as leaders in relation to colleagues? How do I learn to, work with you effectively, authentically, honestly, and develop those relational skills deeply? And they undertook that first step before they even broadened it out. But I can tell you more about how they went about broadening it out more widely and being credible. Because they had to ultimately involve the staff. Do you want me to go into that now, or hold?
Just pause, because a couple of things. When you talked about self-work, I think I'd just like to spend a bit more on that. And I was just thinking about how much self-disclosure was required while they were doing the teamwork. Could you just say a bit more about what that self-work and the self-work within a team setting meant before we go on to and then how did it become credible in the wider
Sure.
organization?
I mean, it involved in a way. It was facilitated in a way like group coaching is. So whilst there would have been there would have been prompts or guidance to help them understand perhaps their leadership experience, their values, the journey they've been on, to help them understand what was driving them, their motivators. So there would have been, not simply psychological assessments, but a rather deeper telling of their leadership stories with each other. Also, relationally, them, literally learning the skills of not just of dialogue, of trying to work through joint decision making, and they had their own particular process, which is very similar to coaching, called the relational leadership framework that they adopted, which was a process for engaging in meaningful dialogue with each other and staying with an issue until they resolved it meaningfully and to the satisfaction of everybody. And I'm not saying consensus, where they could live with dissent, but where they would literally tease out and have dialogue that was really deep and meaningful, where different perspectives could be heard. That spaciousness to really, really think through knotty issues, and to get to a point where people could live with the result, trust that, that was the best decision, and also have the opportunity, to revisit it should they need to. So that would be one mechanism or practice that they developed. And it's tough because it takes time. And it involves, people who are going from being, here I am, I'm an expert in, say, building control. And I am the god of building, I know everything there is to say on it. But actually, I might be wrong. And you're going to have the floor. They developed that space to have the floor where people could come in and give their perspective and say, no, I have another perspective or another viewpoint, and really learning how to feel the give and take while holding on to your, you can hold on to your own judgment, but being open to the influence of others, I suppose, is what I'm trying to describe here. They went through process like that, as well as literally giving each other, learning how to give and receive feedback from each other about how they were performing.
Did anybody leave? I'm
Yes.
just thinking this must have been quite.
Oh, well spotted. Yes. That really got the wheat from the chaff. That really did sort the wheat from the chaff. Yes. It was really interesting, and power reared its head in this setting as well. And if you think about it, if you've been trained and brought up and you've succeeded as an independent player and you've gotten to the top of your game, it's sort of paradoxical, isn't it, to suddenly go, oh well, and now I want to let it all go. There's an inherent paradox there, isn't there?
And it's always struck me as I've always just attributed it to people when they became chief executives. It was, having been brought up to be very individualistically competitive, and suddenly they have to turn into team players. And of course, the people who've wound up into the top jobs are the people who are least equipped for it because they're most viciously, personally driven.
Yeah, I mean, it is notable that that there is still a predominant, there is such a great emphasis on, on individual team development, and still that kind of that under, that reinforcement of that independent nature, that independence, and the focus on individual and skills and discrete, behaviors, etc., as opposed to thinking about actually how do we cultivate our interdependence, which is what, again, some of the the writers that I was digging into were advocates of, and this is what I saw happening there. So on the one hand, to summarize, there was this process of real deep engagement to learn, well, to cultivate that attitude of co-responsibility. So it's a mindset also to cultivate one's empathy, to be able to listen to someone, and empathize with their feelings and thoughts. So that embodied comment that you made a little while ago, that, to feel and to be able to to be able to be authentically, to authentically express intuition and say, oh, that doesn't feel quite right, and actually have that considered in the room. And not to the obviously, and this isn't, it actually, when you start to describe it, it can sound a little bit like a cult, can't it? Like ooh, but it's not. It's actually a very practical, successful business that, that has to deal with, day-to-day numbers, performance, etc. But to be able to actually go through that experience of being that open with each other makes you quite vulnerable. Yeah. So you're learning to be vulnerable, but at the same time, you're learning to support and challenge others. There's a lot of contradictions there, aren't there?
So I think, so again, I noticed that we've kicked off in quite a traditional way by talking about the executive team, but I'm just you already leaning into how did what changed about the relationship between the executive and the wider organization? How did this become an organizationally wide, meaningful experience?
Well, I'd like to sort of caveat that just very briefly with why I wanted to look at this whole debate from what's called in the literature and and in the leadership literature, followership, a follower perspective. Because, arguably you don't have leaders without followers, although there are lots and lots of debates within that, as your audience is already aware. Yes. We won't even go there. But why I thought it mattered first to even have a look-see at this, why and how, and I promise I'll answer your question. I had been working in my, consultancy, facilitating, designing leadership programs where those managers, broad, middle to service level managers in public sector organizations, which would reflect that kind of hierarchy, they were full of dynamite and in creativity and innovation and, great ideas. And very infrequently did they get to be participants on programs where they could, work upwards and connect and communicate upwards. And I thought they had an awful lot to offer. And when I read the literature, by the way, on followers and followership, a lot of the time, they're you get the sense that they're very subservient or passive, or, just fitting in. It's a good follower fits in or, shows courage. But, it felt like they were almost like Girl Guides or Boy Scouts. They're really, I just felt it just didn't feel quite right. So that was my kind of, why I started following the scent. But to answer your question, how did she, establish credibility? Well, when I looked back, I was sort of looking back through my research in anticipation of this, and I saw the steps. I mean, it started with that well-being audit and them sitting in a room with the staff, they had the results of this well-being audit and they were chronically bad, and going in and sat with all the staff and said, right, let us have it. That was the first thing they did. They sat there and they listened. And I think that was symbolic, in terms of the first steps towards them really hearing firsthand from the staff about how it was playing out, how organizational life was playing out. And that was very tough for, the chief executive team to hear. Moving on, what they really wanted. So if you're going to commit to being pregnant, you are going to have to come up with this sort of some principles. And the kind of principles they advocated were that they were really they started advocating about, we want you to become more leaderful, more influential in this business, and more accountable. So they devised within the structure of the organization opportunities, not only for the staff, the wider staff, to experience that type of, if you like, training in dialogue to get to solutions, is a sort of simple way of putting it. So that became normalized in the organization, a different way of peer-to-peer conversation, adult-to-adult conversation, they'd call it. But not only were they doing that, they were also then hosting, and with the support of the board, interestingly, the board were backing this, to the hilt. So they would have these full staff days where they would start cultivating innovation. So, so basically the topic would be innovation. So they had one particular event which was called Mission Possible, which was like a precursor to this, the group of staff getting involved in strategy making, which is the focus of my thesis. But Mission Possible was about, within existing budgets, within the existing limitations of our time and space and whatever you've got, what can you do that could save money, that could be innovative, that could make a difference to our tenants? So it was like an innovation lab. So they hosted that as, for example. They also devolved power. So again, what was happening in functions. So again, I'm forgive me, I've never become an expert in this journey on housing. But for instance, if you were in the within everything from customer services or perhaps governance or the actual or tenant management services, whatever. Each function was invited to, because remember, like, we're not operating in really easy going times. There are stringent financial cuts that are affecting the sector, and this is an organisation that wants to grow. So to run counter to that. So basically, what they wanted to do was invite people to own review their own function and see where they could find savings or different ways of doing things that would save time or money or would be, again, more beneficial. So this functional review, again, could easily have been promoted as times are tough, we need to make savings. You hear that, and so everybody waits for, okay, who in the team's going to be made redundant? Yeah. The critical difference here was it was genuinely devolved. They were the functional leaders, the people who knew their part of the business really well, knew where they could save money, time, etc., expertise, or could partner differently. And it was never, because what was traditional in that sector, senior execs in the board go in, they look at the budget lines, and they just redline services. And I'm quoting from the learning history I created. That's what they said. That's what would happen normally. It doesn't here, and it's become part and parcel of everyday practice, which, that it has, it's not all rosy for the people involved in the business. I mean, that's genuine responsibility, isn't it? For you, it's suddenly, oh gosh, myself and my colleagues, we've got to negotiate how to make this function work. How do we, come in on time, on budget? And what happened? They made more savings. There were more innovations. It was a success. Far more successful than if it had been a decree, if it had occurred, and played out from the CEO level.
But there seems to have been a shift here. I mean, I was always thinking, there's that famous, Deming, I think it's Deming, of, if you want to know how to go do a job better, go and talk to the person who's doing it at the moment. But of course, the reason why, then we're into, if the tradition is, if we're looking for efficiency, it means job cuts.
Yeah.
And you get into this thing. How did you, I'm assuming that somehow they broke that, that if we were talking about savings, it means that one or two of us would have to be fired. And how did that play out?
Well, actually, that was their commitment. They said, we're not firing anyone. Okay. But what we need your help. So it was just literally framed as a completely different proposition. And yet, had they, can you imagine that they had done that and then still people had people had just sort of disappeared? That would have completely broken the trust. So that trust was fragile and it needed to be earned, but that was part of it. And I mean, they didn't know, they didn't know how successful or otherwise it would be, or whether people would. They always, in a sense, again, this isn't happening in a power vacuum. You've always got the kind of get out of jail free card, haven't you? You can always ultimately go back into a room and go, well, if nobody's taken up the opportunity to participate in this, we have the ultimate, sanction, for want of a better word.
But once used, you've then undone all the other work.
Gone. Forget it. It's a sham.
So that was that whole thing about how, that I feel is really important, is that thing of, and I heard and this is not a validated statement, again, for somewhere in, I think it was in the financial services industry, again, of a company which had one of these big away days, and they said, right, there are going to be no compulsory redundancies, but be aware that, the jobs we are going to do, we now need to relocate people to do the jobs that people do best and away from what computers are going to be able to do.
Oh, wow. So they already set the terms. There's another thing that creates psychological safety, doesn't it? I mean, I'm immediately thinking, of, when you think about, when like in a coaching environment. So when you're coaching and you talk about that idea of being in your comfort zone, in the sense of you're only going to come out of there to go into whatever, a learning edge or to any kind of challenge. If you feel safe, if you've actually, we can always, I don't know, there's at least a safety point here. But saying to everybody, go and jump like lemmings off the cliff, it's not going to happen.
Yes, I just wanted to pull out. I loved the framing of the mission possible. Having gone through so many workshops in my life where dream beyond, you just think, oh God, can we just start from the world as it is?
Calm down, everybody. Get a coffee. Yeah, exactly.
but it is. It's that. I'm just thinking it fits into all that notion. You can only change by moving into the adjacent space. You can only become more of what you are. It fits in with all those particular framings. But taken seriously, it creates a completely different psychological contract within the organization.
It does.
A completely different psychological contract between those who have formal positional power and those who don't. Was Angela still in post at the end of the post? And how did she experience her power and authority, once this thing had become embedded? What had happened to her sense of self?
Oh God, this is a lady who is more delighted than, oh my gosh, her sense of self is no way compromised. It's enhanced. Because, I mean, for a start, their organization are winning awards, hand over fist. They mean by I think I sort of pulled out a few stats, but by about 2017, so again, this isn't, lovely and fluffy and let's all hug each other. 2017, they were in the top 2% of the Times top 100 places to work. By 2018, they'd gotten investors and people. They'd gone from gold, which they'd steadily gone from silver when I'm talking, back in 2011. 2018, platinum. Only 2% of all UK registered companies have platinum. And that's private sector as well as this social sector sort of organization. So her sense of self was very, very enhanced and supported, but also it spoke to her values. I mean, that's what I really got a deep sense of her. She really cares. She really cares for her communities and she wants the best for them. And I think she would do anything to get, make that happen. So there was a bigger, it gave her purpose. It gave her meaning, without, wanting to sort of talk too much on her behalf. But that's the sense I strongly, strongly got from her. But also she wanted an organization that was resilient and that would go on after she left. And so that culture is going to take some undoing in that sense. It'll take some breaking down. I mean, yeah, you could revert, but it would take really a lot of, it would be quite chaotic, the process.
I'm just going to read out something that's come in on the chat. This is a way of getting around the recording and getting the ethics who can to be done. So I'm not going to name the person who's done this, but it says, no doubt you have a list of your own curiosities addressed to me. If there's a way to drop in something in on this too, building on the question of vulnerability that Sybille raised, how did senior leaders and other staff handle or regulate their inevitable intense discomforts that tend to arise when a plurality of perspectives are truly engaged with? How did people discover more of their humility and put down their probable needs to be or appear right, certain, competent, and authoritative? This tends to sit in tension, as you said earlier, with the driving personalities of senior leaders. And I've just seen that it's okay I've been given the okay to name this person. This is from Tom Kenwood.
Oh, beautiful question, Tom. I think it's worth framing. It's gorgeous. So in terms of, this kind of speaks to the heart of the study, really. So by the time I get to do my actual in-depth piece of work where I'm looking at how staff from across the organization are genuinely working with not only the senior leadership team as part of a self-selected cohort, volunteered cohort, to co-create the strategic vision. They also are working in relation to the board at key points, who themselves are demonstrating these qualities, by the way, because this particular, again, these practices of experiencing this kind of discomfort about, that kind of team-based dialogue where you're trying to come to decisions, but with these differing perspectives and having to manage and navigate that. One of the key factors in their journey, quite frankly, was the support was facilitation. So Frederick Laloux talks about this idea about to harness the collective intelligence. Using facilitation is a great way of doing that without power plays, power dynamics sort of taking over or positional power dominating. So facilitation. And often then, and what was interesting, in addition to sort of this journey, the training up of organizational facilitators to host such meaningful debates and dialogues was, became part and parcel of everyday life.
So these were internal facilitators.
Internal facilitators, absolutely. So it was an external, so an OD consultant had gone on the journey with them throughout, helping them develop the sort of the main practices and processes to enable this kind of open dialogue. But I don't want to go away from your question. It requires, it's a journey for each person to feel comfortable, because vulnerability, in the way I defined it in my study and the way it's talked about, it's not just about being authentic and being yourself. It's also saying I don't know, and being happy with that. Hell, I don't know. Can anyone help? So it's actually so it became quite normal for conversations. I saw when the board were at the beginning of their training or their induction on this way of working, and I saw the power positions coming out at first. So they needed that kind of, if you like, that bit of experience in how uncomfortable it was before they were sort of let loose working with the staff. But the staff were well, oh my gosh, the things I saw the first day on the, because this speaks to your point, the board are, if you can imagine, there's this open space event. The board are present. They're forming part of the teams looking at the strategic, the strategic priorities that they want to develop. They are sitting in rooms, right? So you could go and choose whatever theme you wanted to join or even move about. But they're sitting in rooms being really strongly challenged on all sorts of issues, like what about the values of our suppliers? They don't match ours. We need to be far more integrated in who we work with. Or what are we doing about sustainable development? I mean, there were some really, big, strong, challenging conversations. And yet the board, they had learned to hold their judgment, and should really and just be open to what was coming. And afterwards, when I sort of, I obviously, I was wandering around and observing, but you could see that it was actually shifting their perceptions, that there were things they just genuinely didn't know. But no matter how hard it got, as in the debate itself, you never ever saw one senior exec or board member turn and go, yeah, well, thanks, we've had enough of that now. It was bring it on. It was bring it on. They had literally created a culture over time, and with everyone sort of, developing their skills in that regard of bring it on. The analogy I have in my life is, becoming a coach. Can you imagine if you didn't get yourself out of the way, how useless you'd be? So for me, it really is akin to that kind of mindset and attitude.
Okay,
does that answer your question?
I've got to concede Tom nodding.
Thanks, Tom.
Thumbs up. And I got another question here. This is, again, Philippa is allowing herself to be named, thank goodness, as the founder of the company. Happy to have mine. What differences did you see, Sybille, between the work that related to creating the vision and the implementation that would follow? What new, different skills or processes were needed, or was it simply more of the same?
Oh gosh. So the first part of your question was, Philippa, was just if you could just repeat that first part, John.
Can I just say, John, just for ease, it's essentially what differences did you see between that vision, the creation of the vision in the way that you described, and then the implementation? Was it, when I said simply more of the same, my simply was in inverted commas, was it more of the same, or did you see new and different things having to be done?
Oh, there's some really interesting. Thanks for bringing that up, because I could see it having, so basically my process just in terms of following. Remember, I'm the researcher. I'm a kind of, an ethnic visitor, ethnographic visitor to the site, if you like. So I'm actually not conducting the work. So I'm literally checking in with the staff between at specific workshops while they're creating it. So I'm getting a sense of how they're creating it. And what I could see is that it was and this is the chairman quoting this when he actually saw was reviewing in depth with a few of his board. It was a thoroughly in-depth piece of work, well researched, far more innovative quotes than they could ever have come up with, and far more far-reaching. So when I spoke to the staff, so that's his, there you go, there's his validation. But internally, the staff had really so whilst they were working in this very, very relational way with each other, and really having the time and space to challenge assumptions and to really deepen and broaden their thinking on whatever organizational solutions they wanted to get involved with, they were also engaging their own staff offline. And the skills they were developing as part of this process and the ones I picked out about being, being way far more open in asking for input and from others, and being way more inclusive in how they would go about solving problems. So that trend started to trickle out in terms of whilst it was being created. In terms of the implementation, so you've got a richer strategy. Of course, it will have, there were other staff. So there was a core of staff who were engaged in the actual co-creation of the strategy process. Afterwards, in the implementation, it was sort of presented to the wider staff team then to implement. They signed up for it, at a full staff event. But there was something I noticed, Philippa, and I noticed the limits of the shared leadership, the kind of the borders of it. Where shared leadership perhaps went, how can I say, it sort of, it reached its limits, if you like. It's a bit like, the water going out, you're sort of disappearing away from the sound. There was a little point where I could see some of the traditional hierarchical tendencies come into play. About, for instance, the board had a very rich time interrogating the strategy in its first or second draft, as did the CEO. By the time it came to the wider staff, and when they were presented with it, they hadn't been on the journey to the same degree. Of course, there were individuals in the room who knew about it. And of course, the actors involved would have had their influence. But what really struck me was this was quite unique. They had worked cross organization, across the hierarchy, all the way from board to frontline staff. They'd managed to do this lovely cross-sectional working. But after that, they didn't support that way of working anymore, which is really interesting. They decided to keep this shared leadership approach, but within functional teams. Now, I put that up as a criticism in my, or a challenge in my thesis. And the way it was sold to the wider staff the same degree of time and involvement wasn't afforded. Now, that could literally, you could say, oh, well, we ran out of time, or perhaps it was a design flaw. I think I'm going to push it a bit further. I think you start reaching the limits where those power dynamics kick in, because you're still a hierarchy and you've still got to get it over the line. If I'm making sense there. And I don't think they did it consciously or with any kind of malintent. I just think that's how they decided to structure it for that point. Whereas I was saying, challenging and saying to them, well, why couldn't you set this up? Because the board and members of this strategy group wanted to carry on working with each other. They wanted to, and there's a writer called Joyce Fletcher, who I've drawn on a lot, and she's she talks about relational mentoring. And it's just really taking account of the fact that, your staff, your frontline staff, they have so much to share. They have so much knowledge that we can learn as much. So, normally in mentoring, thou shalt, I will guide you. And again, there's a degree of being done to. I think there was a great opportunity for reverse mentoring, relational mentoring to continue in some form or fashion. Obviously this stuff costs money, takes time and investment, but they had the genie was out of the bottle.
I'm going to say, I suggest we sort of run for a few more minutes, and then we'll sort of just move into a Q&A. I just want to give you a bit of a breather for a second there, Sybille. And I just want to kind of bring out again, so you can hear Tom's response to the question around the sort of his initial framing about how you experience it. And he says, I see a growing expectation in organizational life that it should be a reasonably comfortable and validating experience. I'm not sure how realistic it is to expect that all or even most of the time. And this just really resonates with my whole experiences. This is about how you actually surface difference and engage constructively with it, rather than pretend it away or bury it, which I think it leads to lots of toxicity. So that really started. And I've got again something from Chris, and I'd suggest this is the last one, and then we'll move into a sort of an open conversation. I'm just looking for some nods there. So Chris has come up with one of the paradoxes in all of this is that often it takes a powerful act from the top or center to cause a move towards creating participation, and how easy it is for this to become, we want participation and inclusion, but only from people who agree that we do it like this and who believe the same stuff as we do.
Yeah. You see, that you can really, that is where I got a sense of perhaps, I mean, one of the things I was debating was, perhaps if this had been a cooperative where there's a sort of different stakeholder relationship, in practical, in real terms, perhaps, that would have produced a different result. But I think it's really interesting within a hierarchy. I really think it was, and I remember having a conversation with the chief exec, and she talked about being able to push the limits of hierarchy as far as they will go. But that doesn't mean that they won't sort of bounce back. They won't sort of, you won't find that edge. However, just to go back to your very brilliant, you cannot not be pregnant, or, there's no halfway house. I just feel there's such a great energy there. There's such a great possibility there for still challenging, becoming more conscious of those power dynamics. I think is really at the heart of some of what I saw. People genuinely, and it was interesting because sometimes different perspectives from the staff group were being shared back to the senior leadership team about how they were experiencing things. Because the way you're describing it, Chris, it can actually lead to, okay, so I'm more leaderful, great. I'm more accountable. I've got more influence. This is wonderful. But I'm actually is that just a proxy for you're just giving me more to do, and the same, without, sort of all the responsibility, without any of the real power or influence or a version thereof. It's really interesting.
Thanks, Sybille. I'm going to suggest now that we stop recording and actually just if people can unmute and we could just have and if people can actually say and let others and let Sybille know what's resonated and not resonated with them.